General Dunford, in his career to service to defend our nation, is the embodiment of a man for and with others, and we are honored to have him as the speaker at our 152nd commencement. Ladies and gentlemen, graduates from 1966, graduating class of 2016, I present to you General Joseph Dunford, Jr.
President Kameza, ladies and gentlemen, and most of all, the class of 2016, you'd expect me to say it, but it's an absolute honor to be back at BC High for this year's commencement. I'd like to begin by once again recognizing the class of 66 celebrating their 50th reunion, and also want to recognize my classmates that are here from the class of 1973, particularly our principal, Steve Hughes, from the class of 1973, who has done so much for BC High over the years, and all the young men who have been fortunate enough to be exposed to his leadership. Steve, if you wouldn't mind, I'd ask you to please stand up. There's another special group of people that are here today, and that's the proud parents of the graduating class, and I'd like to ask the moms and dads in the audience to please stand up. You know, I know that some members of this year's class have lost parents along the way, and we especially miss their presence on days like today, and I know they're here in spirit. You know, as I was preparing my remarks, I had occasion to reflect on my own experience here at BC High, and one particularly clear memory is the first speech that I ever delivered. It was the final requirement for Father Sheridan's speech class in my freshman year, and I was assigned to memorize and deliver a portion of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I reported to class completely unprepared and proceeded to perspire and stumble through my lines. I was relieved when the ordeal was over, and I quickly returned to my seat. And at that moment, I was ready to put speech class behind me, and I had no concerns about what my grade was. And I also thought that I'd find a way to make it through the rest of my life without ever having to give another speech. But Father Sheridan had another idea. He followed me back to my desk, he put his hand on my shoulder, he smiled, and he assigned me to prepare another speech for the next class. And I learned a valuable lesson that day and was better prepared and slightly more confident the next time I came back for round two. Father Sheridan was one of the many members of the faculty and staff here at BC High that had a positive effect on me, even if I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Mr. Audio, Sister Chason, and Mr. Gross also left a positive impression on me. Junior year, I missed months of school due to back surgery, and they routinely came to my house to make sure I didn't fall behind. Father Cuniff, Father Leo, Father Donahue, and Brother Finn, they were among the many, many others that demonstrated commitment, extraordinary generosity, patience, and a sense of humor in guiding me along the way. You know, the names have changed, but in the years ahead, I'm sure that those that are here in the class of 2016 are going to look back on the faculty and staff here at BC High with the same admiration, the same appreciation, and the same affection that I recall those that were here in my era. Because it truly is the faculty and staff that makes BC High so special. So I'd ask the class of 2016 to join me in recognizing your faculty and staff. You know, I mentioned that I clearly remember the first speech I had to deliver at BC High, but one speech that I don't remember at all was the speech at my commencement in 1973. It's true. In fact, I had to do quite a bit of research to find out that our speaker was the now Secretary of State, John Kerry. He was actually just getting involved in his political career. And you know, Secretary Kerry and I routinely now attend the same meetings, and later this week I'm going to have to come clean a little bit sheepishly and tell him that I failed to remember what I'm sure was an absolutely inspiring speech in May of 1973. You know, notwithstanding the quality of the commencement address, my mind on this day for me was miles away from BC High, where I sit right where the class of 2016 is sitting. I was thinking about moving on to college, what I was going to do over the summer. I was thinking about just about anything except what was going on in the ceremony in Heinz Auditorium. And I suspect there's more than a few of you right now, you I'm talking to, there's more than a few of you that are feeling the same way. So with that in mind, I've challenged myself to say something this morning that's relevant to those of you that are graduating. Something that you may actually remember, at least until tomorrow. I'm going to accomplish my mission by sharing a few thoughts on selfless service. And I'm going to ask the class of 2016 to accomplish your mission by staying with me just for a few minutes. And I'm going to ask you to do something that I didn't do. I'm going to ask you to be just perhaps a bit more attentive than I was during my commencement ceremony. It should come as no surprise that I talk about service this afternoon. There's nobody here that's not aware that a BC High graduate will leave Morrissey Boulevard prepared to serve as a man for others. By coincidence, it was about 2 months after I graduated from BC High that the then Superior General of the Society of Jesus, Pedro Arrupe, used the expression men and women for others in articulating what graduates of Jesuit schools should be. Well, Father Arrupe coined that particular phrase. The idea has been at the core of Jesuit identity since the founding of the Society of Jesus. When I graduated from BC High, I had certainly been exposed to the concept of being a man for others. My uncle was a Jesuit, and I listened with interest as my advisor, Father Belcher, my algebra teacher, Father Hicks, and Father Mahoney shared stories of their service in Baghdad in the 1960s. These were men who took a vow of poverty and completely dedicated their lives to service of faith, service of the poor, service of justice, and service of education. Fathers Belcher, Hicks, and Mahoney were in Baghdad in 1968 and taking great personal risk when the Jesuits were expelled after a bloody coup by Saddam Hussein in the Ba'ath Socialist Party. In 2003, I gained a better appreciation for the impact that these men had on others when I found myself on the streets of Baghdad. As my Marines established a protective perimeter around the University of Baghdad, I was approached by an excited group of Iraqis who came over to me and asked me, do I know the Jesuits? And when I told them that I was educated by Jesuits, they proudly took me to the Jesuit house where Fathers Belcher, Hicks, and Mahoney and others had lived in the 1960s. And for several hours, we exchanged stories about our Jesuit educational experience and the lessons that we were taught. We spoke of men who made a difference in our lives. It was an incredible experience. 30 years after high school, thousands of miles from home in an Islamic country, I was witness to the impact of others with a BC High connection. Perhaps because of those extraordinary examples, when I sat with the class of 2016 as sitting, I viewed the idea of living as a true man for others as a worthy goal, but perhaps a standard that few could obtain, and certainly not something I thought that an ordinary man could obtain. And quite frankly, to me, and I was 17 at the time, the level of commitment of those three priests I mentioned seemed absolutely unattainable. But upon reflection, I don't think I really fully appreciated at the time the concept. Sure, I met the BC High requirement for volunteer service, just like the class of 2016. In my case, it was over at the Little House in Dorchester. But I hadn't fully connected the dots on the broader meaning of a Jesuit education. What I've come to appreciate over the years is that living in accordance with the Jesuit ideal and answering God's call to service, it can take many forms. And I've been fortunate enough to know many BC High graduates who have found a way to selflessly serve others. Their examples have informed my own continuing journey to live a life of service and true meaning. One of my personal heroes who embodies selfless service is in the audience today, Captain Tom Kelly from the class of 1956. And I know most members of the class heard Captain Kelly speak last fall. And I'm sure that many have taken the time to read about Captain Kelly on the memorial wall. After graduating from BC High in 1956, Captain Kelly went on to earn a bachelor's degree from Holy Cross in a commission in the United States Navy. Several years later, he was in command of 8 riverine boats and a few dozen American sailors in South Vietnam. And on June 15th, 1969, he was leading his unit when a call to extract the U.S. Army Infantry Company from the marshy waterways that his unit patrolled came in. And while loading that company aboard his boats, one of the craft's ramps became stuck, making both the boat and one of the vehicles that was being loaded aboard that boat immovable. And at about the same time, an enemy force on the opposite side of the river began delivering a withering barrage of automatic rifle and rocket fire against Captain Kelly's force. Recognizing the boat with the stuck ramp was in grave danger, he maneuvered his own boat to the front, and he put himself directly in harm's way to shield his men and the soldiers that were being evacuated. Then young Lieutenant Kelly was subsequently hit by shrapnel to the face, the head, and the eyes, and knocked to the ground by explosions. But he continued to lead his men until the enemy were repelled and the infantry company had been extracted. And I think we all know, for his selfless service and risking his life to others, he did receive our nation's highest award. And Captain Kelly, I just ask you to please stand up. You know, exactly 40 years after Tom Kelly departed BC High, Brian McPhillips received his diploma. And it was mentioned in my introduction that Brian was one of my lieutenants in Marine Regimental Combat Team 5 during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Many of you will recognize the name, and again, I hope you have taken the time to read about Brian on the memorial wall. Brian was born and conquered and lived in Pembroke. His dad had served as a Marine, and that's what inspired Brian to serve. He went on to graduate from Providence College, and after graduation, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. Less than 3 years later, he found himself in Iraq. And during a march to Baghdad in the spring of 2003, after one of the other lieutenants in Brian's tank battalion was severely wounded, Brian volunteered to assume his duties, knowing it was the most demanding assignment for a lieutenant in the battalion. Instead of riding in a heavily armored tank, the assignment called for Brian to be in a thin-skinned Humvee at the point of a column of 20,000 Marines. The unit that Brian had volunteered to lead was pretty shaken up after the loss of their lieutenant days earlier, and the leadership had to consider whether or not that unit would even be able to continue to perform its mission. But Brian had a superb reputation in the battalion as a lieutenant who knew his stuff and who took care of Marines. And he quickly earned the confidence and inspired them to press on. Brian and his men were tasked to fix the enemy and to locate civilians who might otherwise be caught between us and the Iraqi army. Brian's task was to protect civilian non-combatants and keep our Marines alive. In short, he was performing, in my mind, duty in a manner consistent with the just war doctrine of Thomas Aquinas, a name that I'm sure he became familiar with here at BC High. On April 4th, 2003, Brian was killed on the outskirts of Baghdad while living up to Jesuit values, leading his Marines from the front and serving as a protector of the innocent. You know, one of the reasons I shared these particular stories this afternoon is because I've made a personal commitment not to let the sacrifice and valor of men like Tom Kelly or Brian McPhillips be forgotten. But that's not the primary reason why I recall their stories to you, the class of 16, at today's commencement. What's most important about their examples is not that they served in uniform or that they were physically courageous. And it's not how Brian McPhillips died that makes his story relevant to you. The stories of Tom Kelly and Brian McPhillips would be appropriate to share even without recalling the events of June 1969 or April 2003. As a leader, Tom Kelly had a reputation for putting the needs of his sailors ahead of his own and for being someone special long before and long after that fateful day in 1969. He was and remains a man of character and faith. Following decades of service in uniform, he continued to serve, first as a civilian in the Department of Defense, and later as the Massachusetts Secretary of Veterans Affairs. He established a reputation as a humble and a selfless public servant. His focus was on employment, housing, and medical care for veterans and their families. He was a powerful advocate for the unemployed, homeless, and those suffering from the visible and invisible wounds of war. And today he continues to strongly advocate to educate children who have lost their parents in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Similarly, before coming into the Marine Corps, Brian McPhillips was known as a man for others. He was a great son and older brother, a man of strong faith and conviction, and someone who was always more focused on the needs of his Marines than he was on his own. Like the class of 2016, he performed many hours of volunteer service while he was in BC High, and he continued to do so after graduation. You know, on the surface, the examples of Tom Kelly and Brian McPhillips may seem to reflect a degree of commitment as unattainable to the class of 2016 as the example of Father Hicks, Father Belcher, and Father Mahoney was to me in 1973. And there's no doubt that their heroic actions were extraordinary. And additionally, few here are going to serve in the United States military or be in a position to make the ultimate sacrifice for our nation or for their subordinates. But if you would reflect just a minute on these two examples, I can hope you can see their actions and their influence transcend their particular profession or their demonstration of physical courage. I don't believe Captain Kelly would mind me saying this, but he is, and Brian McPhillips was, as most of us here are, ordinary men. But in the case of Brian McPhillips and Tom Kelly, they were able to accomplish extraordinary things in life because of their selfless service. In my judgment, they both lived a life completely consistent with the words of Father Rupe in the Jesuit tradition. And their examples highlight the point I made earlier when I said that living the Jesuit ideal and answering God's call to service can take many forms. My message to the class of 2016 is that being a man for others is not abstract or an overly high standard that only a few extraordinary individuals can attain. It's not something that requires the total commitment of a Jesuit or of a Medal of Honor recipient. It's something that can be achieved in many ways and in any walk of life. In fact, something that every BC High graduate should expect to attain. If history is any indication, in just a few years, members of the class of 2016 will be found all over the globe. Some will be doctors, others will be leaders in industry, government, or education. Some will serve in uniform or follow a non-traditional path that's actually inconceivable as we gather here today. So I'm going to close with a simple request for each member of the class of 2016, one BC High grad to another. Go forth and chase your dreams without forgetting the cardinal direction that you established while you're here at BC High. Regardless of where life takes you, commit to selfless service, to being part of something that's bigger than yourself. Have the moral courage to stand up for what's right and just. Take the time in your daily life to serve in a way that matters, in a way that means something to you. In the end, perhaps inspired less by the specific actions of Father Belcher, Father Hicks, Father Mahoney, Brian McPhillips, or Tom Kelly, but more by their spirit, be a man for others. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the privilege of joining you today. For the class of 16, God bless you all in your future endeavors, AMDG, and Semper Fidelis.